everybody, welcome to UK Gaming Network. I'm Brian, also known as UKGN Zoidberg, and this is Retrogaming Superleagues, where I rank all of the games that I have played in a specific category. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about a category that I've probably played more than any other, and that is the arcade racing game. I've played probably more of these games than any other across my entire gaming life, across multiple consoles. So which ones do I consider to be the best ones on the Amiga? Let's find out together. So as always, the games in this video are going to be ranked in one of 5 categories. We have essential, recommended, good, poor or rubbish. So without further ado, let's get on with it. So the first game that we have to talk about is 1000 Miglia, released in 1991 from Simulmondo, and this is based on a 1,000 mile race in vintage cars. It's got some excellent presentation, which really does capture the vintage feel brilliantly. The novelty value of racing vintage cars doesn't wear off as quickly as you'd think, although the fragility of the old cars does get annoying after a while. It's got a nice strategic element to the gameplay though, where you can only take a limited number of spare parts with you. It's very playable and looks excellent with a good sense of speed, but I don't think I can place it any higher than the good category, so that's where it's going to go. Next up we have 4x4 Off-Road Racing, released in 1988 by Epix and published by US Gold. This would probably like to think of itself as an off-road equivalent of Accolade's Test Drive, where you get to pick real-life 4x4s and take them out for a spin. In reality, it's a horrible looking, jerky and incredibly boring slog. Even at the maximum speed that you can travel, it's incredibly slow and it's really boring, and you'll probably want to stop playing it very quickly. So I am going to put this one in the poor category. Next up we have African Raiders 01, released in 1989, developed by Tomahawk and published by Cocktail Vision. This is a truly appalling and unplayable mess with some shockingly poor design decisions. If you thought 4x4 Off-Road was bad, just wait till you check this one out. Keeping track of where you're supposed to be going is nigh on impossible, as there's no on-screen indicators whatsoever. And for some reason, you can't even steer the car while you're accelerating or braking, and that just kills the gameplay stone dead. So there's nowhere I can put this one other than right down at the bottom in the rubbish category. Next up we have Big Run, released in 1992 from the Sales Curve, published by Storm. This is based on the Jaleco arcade game, and it's not brilliant, but it's definitely one of the better arcade conversions that we're going to come to on this list. It maintains the speed and is quite smooth, but that's at the expense of the detail in the scenery. There's also a distinct lack of colour throughout the graphics as a whole. Just check out the horrendous looking spectators and people at the end of each stage. One thing that I would have liked in this game though is for there to be some markings on the cars that you're actually racing against, as they all look exactly the same, so you've got no idea whether or not you're gaining a position when you overtake somebody. Apart from that though, it is quite entertaining, so it's not bad enough for the poor category, so I'm going to stick this one in good, and I think I will put this one above 1000 Miglia. Next we have Buggy Boy, released in 1988, published by Elite Systems and developed by Tatsumi. This is an excellent arcade conversion that really does capture the fun of the arcade original. It's got tons of replay value, as there are many secret ways to rack up huge scores for you to discover as you play. It's not the smoothest game in the world, but the graphics are clear and colourful and the gameplay is great fun. I'm going to make this the first game that I put in the recommended category. Next we have Bump and Burn, which came out in 1994, developed by Soft Eyes Design and published by Grand Slam. This was a nice attempt at making a kart racer for the Amiga, but the characters that are in it are all a little bit bland and generic as far as I'm concerned. The graphics are bright and colourful, but the tracks themselves are incredibly boring to race around. If you're playing this on the A1200, then it would probably score lower, but if you're playing the CD32 version, it is slightly better, as it caters for more buttons on the controller. It's still not great overall though, so I am going to stick this one in the poor category, but it's definitely better than 4x4 Off-Road. Next up we have Burning Rubber, which came out in 1993, developed by Harlequin and published by Ocean Software. This also featured music by Utah Saints. It is a really frustrating game though. as the idea of choosing your own route across the levels is a brilliant one. It's just the game doesn't make the most of it. It's fast and playable, but the graphics are a complete mess, making it impossible to see what's happening on screen for a lot of the time. And it's far too easy to miss one of the turns that you should be taking, which can completely destroy your entire race and make you have to start again. Also, the car that you're driving looks like it's been squashed between two trucks, but maybe that's just me. I am going to stick this one in the good category though. I don't think it's good enough to go any higher than that, and I think I'm going to put this one below Big Run. Next we have Chase HQ, which came out in 1989 from Ocean Software, and this one was developed by Tech Software. If I was making this list entirely from memory, then this game would probably go quite a bit further down than I'm going to put it. But seeing as I have actually replayed all of these games before putting this list together, it's actually not as bad as I remember it being. It's still not great though. I mean, the graphics are terrible, and there is a bit of a disconnect between the speed that it tells you that you're travelling and what it actually looks like on screen. But it really does sound exactly like the arcade version, and there's still some fun to be had from ramming criminals off the road. And I think for that reason, it's not quite bad enough for the poor category, so I am going to put this one at the bottom of the good, below 1000 Miglia. Next we have Chase HQ 2 Special Criminal Investigation. Released in 1990, once again from Ocean Software, this time developed by ICE. And this is much worse than the first game, mainly because shooting enemies is far less exciting than actually chasing them down. It still manages to sound like the arcade original, and it does actually feature both music and sound effects at the same time. However, the road movement is incredibly slow, and the scenery lurches into view, and the handling is just awful. I really didn't like this one at all, so this one is going to go in the poor category, and I'm going to put this one below 4x4 Off-Road. Next we have Cisco Heat, released in 1992, developed by ICE, published by Imageworks. This is one that I covered on the re-review in episode 22. It is admittedly a complete mess, but it's also surprisingly enjoyable. The entertaining chaos of the arcade original still exists in this game, and the San Francisco setting is excellent. Once you've finished the game with both of the two cars that it offers though, there's very little here to make you want to come back and play it again. If you want to know more about my opinion of this, then do go back and watch that re-review episode. But I am going to put this one in the good category as well, and I think I'm going to put this one just below Big Run. Next we come to Continental Circus, which is developed by the same team behind Chase HQ at Tech Software, this time published by Virgin Interactive in 1989. Even though this one was released earlier than Chase HQ, it is a lot better. I remember being incredibly disappointed when the first time I played this game with the fact that the explosions are a pathetic imitation of what you got in the arcade version, but other than that though, this is a pretty decent conversion all round and a lot of fun to play. I am going to put this one into the recommended category, I think, and I think I'm going to put this one above Buggy Boy. Next we come to Crazy Cars, released in 1988 by Titus Software, and this is a woefully basic racer that's clearly had much more effort put into the graphics on the cars themselves than anything else in the game. The road feels like it's just a colour cycle run in deluxe paint and doesn't move at all on the screen, instead making the car move left and right. I can't imagine anyone playing this who won't get bored within minutes of loading it up. And this one's going to go right down at the bottom in the rubbish category, and I think I'm going to put this one above African Raiders, but only just. Next up we have Crazy Cars 2, which came out the following year, 1989, also from Titus Software. And surely you'd think that they would improve things for the sequel, right? Wrong. This is even worse than the first game. It's got some truly horrendous controls, and even driving in a straight line is far harder than it should be. Apart from the odd police car that pops up from time to time, the roads are completely empty, and if you do happen to touch the police car even slightly, then you will explode in a huge fireball. The best thing about the game is the title screen and how good the actual Ferrari looks in game, which obviously looked really good on the back of the box as well and fooled people into buying it, myself included. This is going to go below the original Crazy Cars and below African Raiders in the rubbish category, right down there at the bottom. Next up, we have Crazy Cars 3, which came out in 1992, once again by Titus Software, and I reviewed this one myself in Amiga Action in the first issue that I ever worked on. This is a contender for the most improved sequel in the history of gaming, not just on the Amiga, of all gaming. It's gone from being the worst racer you can imagine to possibly one of the best. All of the locations that you race on in America all look great, and the sense of speed is fantastic. It's also really, really playable. This is going to be the first game that I put in the essential category, so all the way up there at the top. Next up, we have Driving Force, which came out in 1990 from Digital Magic Software, and this is fantastic as a tech demo, but the game itself is hugely frustrating. It's got a huge number of tracks and modes for you to play, and it does move very, very quickly, but I found it really hard to play. The mouse control is way too sensitive, with no option to reduce that sensitivity, and there was no joystick option that I could find. I found it hard just to take even the most simple of corners, and would crash constantly into the scenery. So that's going to drop this one right down into the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one just below Bump and Burn. Next up, we have F-17 Challenge, released in 1993, published by Team 17, and developed by a Spanish team called Hollow Dream. This was actually released at budget price, and as far as I'm concerned, this is almost up to the quality of many of the full price releases on this list, Jaguar and Lotus included. You can play a full Grand Prix season or single races on any of the 17 tracks on the calendar. I could never understand why the reviews weren't stronger at the time, as I loved it then, and I still love it now. Being able to personalize the color scheme of your car is a really nice touch, and it's incredibly playable and fast. So for me, this is going to go in the essential category, but it's definitely not quite as good as Crazy Cars 3. Next up, we have GB Air Rally, released in 1987, published by Activision. This is certainly unique on this list, as you are racing planes rather than cars, and piloting high-speed aircraft makes for a really nice change, and this remains just as playable today as it was in 1987. Unfortunately, there's also not an awful lot to it, as apart from a few races against the clock and some balloon popping, there's not really a lot else that you can do. Scenery is also virtually non-existent, giving the graphics a very basic look. But I think I'm going to stick this one in the good category, and I'll put this one just below 1000 Miglia. Next up, we have Grid Start, which came out in 1987, published by Anko. This is an incredibly poor and lazy clone of Pole Position, with 6 tracks that all look identical when you're actually playing them. The collision detection is shockingly poor. The instant explosions whenever you collided with another car worked in the arcade original of Pole Position, because you actually felt like you could avoid hitting things, which you never feel like here. The lap counter reads 99 laps when you start the game, and to be perfectly honest, you'll probably get bored before you've done 2. This one's going to go right down in the rubbish category, and I think I am going to put this one just above Crazy Cars 2. Next up, we have Highway Hawks, released in 1988, also from Anko Software, and this is from the same design team that made Grid Start. They came back a year later, this time with their take on Road Blasters. It's definitely much better than their previous game, but that's not really saying much. Gameplay is incredibly repetitive, with identical looking roads populated by the same old trucks and cars over and over again. It takes far too long to unlock a better arsenal, and by the time that you do, most people will have gotten bored and moved on. So this one is also going to go in the rubbish category, but I think I'm going to put this one above the original Crazy Cars. Next, we come to Jaguar XJ220, released in 1992 from Core Design. This was a blatant attempt from Core to make their own answer to Lotus, and it's incredibly fast and playable, but let down by a few annoying flaws. Amongst those are the fact that the early races take too long to complete, and you never really know how far ahead or behind your opponents you are, so you can find yourself just speeding along an empty road, which isn't particularly exciting. I do get the feeling that if they had actually gone on and made a sequel and ironed out all these problems, that we could have been talking about the best racing game on the Amiga. Unfortunately, as it is, it's not quite in the conversation. The track editor, though, is really nicely put together, and it adds value to the overall experience. And I think that's going to have me put it at the top of the recommended category, just above Continental Circuits. Next, we have Lamborghini American Challenge, released in 1994 from Titus. And when I say that this is the same game as Crazy Cars 3, I mean it is exactly the same game as Crazy Cars 3. Literally, the only thing that they added was the two-player mode that they forgot to have the first time around. And that split-screen two-player mode is really, really good. Everything that you did or didn't like about Crazy Cars 3 is identical in this game. The menus, characters and map screen and the game structure is all exactly the same as it was. At least the music is different. So it's still great. And by virtue of having the two-player mode, that means that it's slightly better than the first Crazy Cars 3. So I am going to stick it just above that and at the top of the pile. Next, we have Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge, released in 1990, developed by Magnetic Fields and published by Gremlin. And this is the first, and as far as I'm concerned, best of the Lotus trilogy. The balance between fun and difficulty is just about perfect in this one, and I always found this to be one of the best competitive two-player games on the Amiga. It's got a huge number of tracks to learn, and having fuel stops in the races really does add much needed strategy and helps to keep your interest. It's a shame that when you play it single player, it doesn't expand to full screen, but that's pretty much the only downer in the entire game. So for me, this goes right at the top above Lamborghini American Challenge. And that brings us to Lotus Turbo Challenge 2, which came out in 1991. Once again, published by Gremlin and developed by Magnetic Fields. This is technically a massive improvement over the first game, with full screen graphics and looking absolutely amazing. But for some reason, I could never really understand why they ditched the championships in favour of a more arcade-like checkpoint system. Consequently, for me at least, I feel like it loses all of the longevity that the first game had, and I've always considered it to be a massive disappointment. The single-player mode does have a excellently judged difficulty curve, though, with each of the stages that you come to ramping up in difficulty as you go. And back in the day, having the ability to link two Amigas together and play with 4 players was immensely fun. So although it's disappointing, it's still essential, but not as good as the first game. And I think I'm going to put this one below Crazy Cars 3. Next, we come to Lotus 3 The Ultimate Challenge, released in 1992. This actually had its name changed from Lotus 3 The Final Challenge. Obviously, they really wanted to leave it open-ended with the possibility of making another, but they never actually did. This tried to be the best of both worlds, featuring both circuit races and stages against the clock. Consequently, it feels a little bit overstuffed, and some of the new stages feel either completely out of place or just not very good. I'm looking at you, future. It still does look great, and it's just as playable as before, with another stonking soundtrack. The Rex track editor, though, is nothing more than a novelty, and nowhere near up to the quality of the one that featured in Jaguar. So for me, I am going to stick this one in the recommended, and I think I am going to put this one below Jaguar XJ220. Next, we come to Moonshine Racers, released in 1991, developed by Peakstar Software and published by Millennium. This is from the same team that were responsible for Continental Circus and Chase HQ, and it falls somewhere between those two in terms of quality. I actually gave this one just 15% in the budget pages of Amiga Action back in 1992, but from playing it again today, I was definitely overly harsh in that classification. There's definitely some fun to be had in transporting your illegal booze and avoiding the police, even if the game is not very fast moving, which was the thing that I didn't really like about it first time around. It's also got a really good soundtrack. So this one is going to go in the good category, and like I said, it's better than Chase HQ, but I think I'm going to put this one above 1000 Miglia. Next we come to Outrun, released in 1989, developed by Probe Software and published by US Gold. And basically what it seems like this is that they swapped out the Ferrari for a Ford Cortina. in this infamous, for all the wrong reasons, arcade conversion. It had a really excellent title screen that gave everybody false hope as it loaded for what turned out to be a horrid, lurching mess of a racing game. There probably are worse games on this list, but none that are as much of a travesty. So this one is going to go in the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one just below the original Crazy Cards. Next, we come to Outrun Europa, released in 1991, covered in episode 2 of the re-review, or way back when, and it's only really connected to the Sega series in name, as it bears no real similarity to the other games in the series. What you get is a loosely connected series of races featuring bikes, boats and sports cars as you race across Europe across 7 stages. The water stages themselves are really, really poor, but the rest of the stages are pretty decent and offer a good amount of speed and playability. So if you can stomach the water stages, there is enough here to make it worth your while. So I am going to put this one in the good category, I think, just above Big Run. Next, we have Overlander, released in 1989 from Elite Systems, and this is a post-apocalyptic racer with elements taken from Road Blasters, yet it somehow manages to be really, really boring. Inexplicably, it doesn't look or play as nice as the Atari ST version. Why did they change the look of the car, for starters? Movement is smooth, and there's a nice risk versus reward aspect to the gameplay, but to be honest, it's very hard to recommend, as I didn't really enjoy it at all. So I'm going to stick this one in the poor category, and I think I'm going to put this one just above 4x4 Off-Road. Next, we have Power Drift, released in 1989, developed by Software Studios and published by Activision. The actual programming for this one was done by ZZKJ, who is a name that's going to be coming up again later on in this list. And in many ways, this should be classed as an impossible conversion. So it's probably as good as it was ever going to be. But for that reason, I would class it as an admirable failure. Both the mouse and joystick controls do work quite well, considering. But you'll still really struggle to see what's going on most of the time, especially on some of the more complicated circuits. So I'll stick this one at the top of the poor category. Next, we have Prime Mover, which came out in 1993 from publisher Psygnosis, developed by Interactivision. This is a very slick and playable motorbike racer that takes many of its cues from the original Lotus. While the graphics themselves are smooth and fast-moving, I found that the view it gives the player of the action is a little bit too low to the ground for my liking, and it makes seeing the other bikes a little bit trickier than it should be. Ultimately, there's also not quite enough tracks and options for it to achieve classic status, but it's definitely an enjoyable effort, and I'm going to put this one at the bottom of the recommended category, just below Boogie Boy. Next, we have Road Blasters, which came out in 1988, once again published by US Gold and developed by Probe Software. And as arcade conversions go, this is actually better than most, and it's easily better than Overlander and Outrun. As it's based on an arcade machine, the gameplay is extremely limited, which ends up making it more than a little repetitive. But that's actually the fault of the arcade original as well, so you can't really fault the conversion for it. Graphics are a bit of a mixed bag. Your car looks okay most of the time, but as soon as it spins or turns a corner, it looks really, really terrible. And I don't think it's quite good enough to go into the good category. So I am going to stick this one just below Power Drift in the poor category. Next, we have Street Racer, which didn't come out on the Amiga until 1997. Developed by Vivid Image Design, and it was picked up for publishing by Acid Software after Ubisoft had left it on the shelf for a couple of years. Even on the SNES, where it came out 3 years earlier, this was a bland Mario Kart wannabe with very little lasting appeal, as far as I'm concerned. The Amiga version is fun for a few races, I'll give it that, and it has some really excellent graphics, but I still got bored very, very quickly. It also doesn't help that the controls are absolutely appalling. At the end of the day, they probably shouldn't have bothered releasing the Amiga version of this one at all. I'm going to stick this one in the poor category, and I think I'm going to put it just above Bump and Burn. Next, we have Super Hang-On, which came out in 1988, developed by Software Studios and published by Electric Dreams. This is another one by ZZKJ, and this is a simply brilliant arcade conversion and a hugely enjoyable game in its own right that I keep coming back to every year or so. Both the mouse and joystick controls are excellent, featuring 3 levels of sensitivity, so anybody can set their preference. The gameplay is just as challenging and addictive today as it was when this game first hit the shelves, and in fact this is so good that it makes you look at Outrun, which came out a year later, and just despair. So this is going just below Lotus in the essential category. Next we have Super Monaco GP, released in 1991, developed by US Gold and published by Probe Software, although once again the programming is by ZZKJ. And just like Super Hang-On, this is another excellent conversion, although it's much closer to the Mega Drive game than it is to the arcade original. Not that that's a problem. It is supremely tough, but incredibly rewarding, and the mouse control I found to be really, really excellent. It's only really the lack of tracks that holds it back from being truly top tier. It's definitely going in the essential category for my liking, and I'm going to put this one just above F-17 Challenge. Next we have Top Gear 2, which came out in 1994 from Gremlin Graphics, and Top Gear on the SNES always felt like it was an attempt to give console players their own version of Lotus. So for that reason, I always felt that converting it back to the Amiga felt like a bit of a pointless exercise to me. It is a pretty enjoyable game in its own right, admittedly, but you're definitely better off playing the SNES version in that regard. The whole time that I was playing it, I was sat there thinking, why am I not playing Lotus instead? Which is not something that you got if you played it on the SNES. So for me, this is going to go in the recommended category, and I think I'm going to put it just below Continental Circus. Next we have Touring Car Racer, which came out in 1991, published by Biteback and developed by Cloud9 Development. This is an absolutely hopeless attempt to bring the thrill of touring car racing to the Amiga. It has static vehicles on the screen and one of the worst road routines that I've ever seen, which results in a game that makes crazy cars look like the arcade version of Outrun. Even the menu screens have the look of a cheap public domain title. This is quite simply one of the laziest Amiga games there is. It's the worst game in this video by quite some distance, and considering how bad some of the games have been up to this point, that's saying something. So right down at the bottom of the rubbish category you go. Next we have Turbo Cup, which came out in 1988 from Loriciel, and this has got really great graphics that are ruined slightly by gameplay that's overly fiddly, but if you persevere with it, it does get better with practice. I found that it was far too easy to spin out on even the most shallow of turns, and the game only has 4 circuits overall and no championship mode, which means that there's not an awful lot here to keep you playing for long periods, which is a shame, as it's a game that felt like it had potential, but it doesn't get anywhere near achieving it. And I'm going to put this one above GB Air Rally in the good category. Next we have Turbo Outrun, released in 1990 from US Gold. This one was developed by ICE Software. Yes, another arcade conversion from ICE, and another one that's really not very good, and quite possibly the worst of the three games featured in this video. It does maintain a decent level of speed, but it runs at about 3 frames a second, and you can never see what's going on in the slightest. The stages are at least varied, even if they are way too short, but that's also, just like Road Blasters, a fault of the arcade machine and not this game. At least the graphics in this one do actually look arcade accurate, which is a step up from the original Outrun, but in gameplay terms this is actually worse than the first Outrun, so I'm going to put this one just above Grid Start in the rubbish category. And now for the final game, we have Extreme Racing, released in 1995, published by Black Legend and developed by Siltuna Software, who I've never really heard of before or since. When you load this one up, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's going to be more of a tech demo than an actual game. The truth is, there's actually a quite enjoyable kart racer here, much more so than either Street Racer or Bump and Burn. The developers actually seem to have played Mario Kart and understand the appeal of it. I did find that the graphics were very grainy though, which is probably a drawback of trying to replicate Mode 7 visuals on the Amiga. So that consequently makes it a game that you're not really going to want to play for long periods. Not good enough for recommended, and I don't think bad enough for the poor, so it's going to go in good. And I think I will put this one just above Moonshine Racers. So there you go, that's 39 arcade racing games for the Amiga, all ranked. Please remember that this list is in no way gospel and is merely my own personal opinion. If you disagree with any of the positionings on screen here, please do let me know where you would have put them instead. I love hearing your thoughts in the comments. Also, while you're at it, if you have any suggestions of categories that you'd like to see me cover in this series, please pop up and make those suggestions as well. And hopefully I'll give you a name check in an upcoming video. So until next time, thank you very much for watching. Make sure you give us a like and subscribe if you've enjoyed it. And please do consider becoming a member if you want to watch these videos early. Details of the membership offer are in the video description. So until next time, happy retro gaming. Bye for now.